In the quiet of a frozen castle, two people are tired of being enemies. The war is over, but the winter is long. Sometimes a little warmth is the most dangerous thing of all. The story is being written in this very moment. The rain did not simply fall against the ancient stones of Hogwarts. It lashed at the mullioned windows with the frantic rhythm of a creature desperate to be let inside. The heavy, damp autumn air carried the chill of the Black Lake straight through the drafty corridors of the 7th floor, settling deep into the marrow of anyone foolish enough to be wandering after curfew. Hermione Granger stood at the apex of the grand staircase, the tooth of old parchment, her meticulously drafted patrol schedule, crushed against the palm of her left hand. The castle was breathing around her, a slow, laboured inhalation of drafts and creaking timber. It was a wounded beast, still healing from the fires of May, just as they all were. Her fingers drifted upward, tracing the cold enamel of the head girl badge pinned to her cloak. It felt less like an honour tonight, and more like a heavy iron anchor dragging her into the freezing depths of exhaustion. She checked her pocket watch. The gold casing caught the muted, flickering light of a lone sconce. Midnight. A hollow echo of footsteps materialized from the shadows of the adjacent corridor. The sound was deliberate, measured, utterly devoid of the frantic, shuffling panic of a student caught out of bounds. The atmospheric pressure in the corridor seemed to drop instantly, the oxygen turning thin and metallic. Draco Malfoy stepped into the dim perimeter of the torchlight. He wore the black robes of his station, the headboy badge glinting like a sliver of ice on his chest. There was a time when he would have worn the silver and green with a sneer, shoulders squared in arrogant superiority. Tonight, his posture was rigidly controlled, a posture born not of pride, but of strict, unyielding defense. Away, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on a point away. His jaw tight, eyes fixed on a point somewhere just to the left of her shoulder. Hermione's fingernails bit into the parchment in her hand. The silence between them was not empty. It was a dense, suffocating static. It was the tactile friction of two opposing forces trapped in a sealed vessel. "The 3rd floor charms corridor first," she said. Her voice, intended to be authoritative and brisk, betrayed her with a faint, imperceptible tremor. Filch reported a lingering drafted hex near the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy. Malfoy gave a fraction of a nod. The movement was so slight, it could have been a trick of the flickering light. He turned, his dark cloak billowing silently behind him, and began to walk. He expected her to follow. The sheer arrogance of the assumption sent a sharp spike of heat through her chest, burning away the damp chill of the draft. Hermione adjusted her cuffs, a sudden, frantic need to ensure the pristine white edges were perfectly aligned beneath her sleeves before falling into step beside him. They did not walk shoulder to shoulder. A precise, unyielding gap of 2 feet remained between them as they descended the marble staircase, an invisible boundary line drawn by history and blood. Yet, the visceral alignment of their movements was impossible to ignore. When she slowed to navigate a treacherous trick step, his stride fractionally delayed. When the wind howled fiercely against a pane of glass, causing her to flinch, the knuckles of his right hand, gripping his wand inside the deep pocket of his cloak, whitened visibly against the dark fabric. The descent to the third floor was steeped in shadows. Here, the scent of ozone after a hex still clung to the tapestries, a bitter metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. Thickened. The torches here inexplicably thickened. The torches here inexplicably extinguished. Lumos, Hermione murmured, the tip of her vinewood wand igniting with a pure white flare. Almost simultaneously, a cold, silvery light bloomed to her right. Malfoy had cast the same spell, entirely non-verbally. The twin beams of light intersected against the stone floor, illuminating a stretch of wall that had been poorly repaired. The masonry was cracked, the mortar crumbling into a fine grey dust. Malfoy's steps faltered. The silver ring on his left index finger bit violently into his skin as his hand clenched into a fist at his side. He stared at the fractured wall, his pale eyes entirely vacant, the iron-clad barriers of his occlumency freezing his features into a mask of pure porcelain. He wasn't seeing the stone. He was seeing the fire. He was seeing the dust of falling barricades. Hermione's breath hitched. The impulse to reach out, to touch the dark wool of his sleeve and break the trance, was sudden and terrifyingly strong. It was a treacherous, foolish instinct. She forced her arm to remain rigid at her side, the nails of her wand hand pressing into her palm. "It's just a draft," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper to hide the vulnerability leaking into her tone. "The stonemasons haven't stabilized this wing yet." He blinked, the harsh movement shattering the porcelain mask for a fraction of a second. His gaze snapped to hers. In the stark, underlit glow of their wands, his eyes were the color of a stormy sea churning against sharp rocks. The magnetic pull between them intensified, a gravitational anomaly right there in the empty hall. He took a half step toward her. The air vanished. The space between them collapsed to a mere breath, the sharp, clean scent of bergamot and winter frost rolling off his robes and colliding with her senses. Hermione braced herself, her chin tilting up defensively, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She prepared for the sneer, the barbed insult designed to re-establish the hierarchy of their hostility. Instead, he looked down at her, his gaze dropping to the frantic pulse beating visibly at the base of her throat. The muscle in his jaw feathered. Then, as abruptly as the invisible tether had pulled them together, he violently severed it. He stepped back, the repulsion immediate and physical. He extinguished his wand light with a sharp flick of his wrist, plunging his side of the corridor back into the abyssal dark. "Keep your light steady, Granger," he muttered, his voice a low, raspy scrape against the silence. "Unless you plan on missing the tripwire hex someone so graciously left for us just ahead." Hermione's head whipped around, barely illuminated at the very edge of her wand's reach. A faint, shimmering thread of purple magic was stretched taut across the corridor, hovering inches above the stone floor. She had been so consumed by the erratic shift in the air, so completely pulled into the gravity of his hollow stare, that she had walked them right to the edge of a snare. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck. She dropped to a crouch, her robes pooling on the damp stone, aiming her wand at the base of the hex. Her hands were shaking. She despised the tremor, despised that he could undoubtedly see it from the shadows above her. "I have it," she snapped, though he hadn't offered to help. She began the delicate wand work to unravel the curse, muttering the counter-incantation under her breath. But the magic was volatile, crackling with a rebellious spark. As the final syllable left her lips, the purple thread snapped, emitting a high-pitched, wailing shriek that echoed violently off the stone walls. Before Hermione could even flinch, a hand clamped firmly around her upper arm, hauling her upward and backward with a jarring impact. She stumbled against a hard, unyielding chest, the world tilting sharply as a burst of localized wind erupted from the shattered hex, showering the spot where she had just been kneeling with a spray of sharp, stinging sparks. The echo of the small explosion faded, leaving only the sound of the rain and the harsh, ragged sound of their synchronized breathing. Hermione was pinned back against the wall, Malfoy's body a rigid shield standing directly between her and the dissipating smoke. His hand was still wrapped tight around her arm, his long fingers pressing through the thick wool of her cloak, burning like a brand against her skin. He didn't move away. The shadows cloaked them, the darkness pressing in, thick and expectant. She could feel the erratic thump of his heart radiating through his layers, a desperate, frantic drumbeat that completely betrayed his icy exterior. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he turned his head, looking down at her trapped form in the dark. The heat of his palm seared through the damp wool of her sleeve, a brand that threatened to melt straight down to the bone. For a fraction of a second, the universe contracted until it consisted only of the rigid line of his chest pressing against her shoulder, the harsh, shallow rhythm of his breathing, and the darkness that enveloped them both. The scent of bergamot, rain-soaked earth, and the sharp metallic tang of his residual magic flooded her senses. It was an intoxicating, terrifying combination. Hermione's back was flush against the unforgiving stone of the corridor wall, but she barely felt the cold. Every nerve ending she possessed was hyper-focused on the physical anchor of his grip. She looked up into the shadows where his face was obscured, catching only the faint, erratic gleam of his pale eyes reflecting the dying embers of the shattered hex. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a bowstring. The atmospheric pressure in the narrow space grew agonizingly dense, heavy with unspoken accusations and a magnetic pull so visceral it made her head spin. She could feel the rapid flutter of his heartbeat, echoing the frantic tempo of her own. A traitorous physiological confession that beneath the headboy badge and the impenetrable occlumency shields, Draco Malfoy was just as terrified and disoriented as she was. He looked down at her, his gaze locked onto her parted lips. The tremor in her fingers transferred to her wand, the wood vibrating faintly against her palm. She waited, suspended in the dark, for him to speak, to insult her, to ask if she was injured, to do something. Instead, realizations seemed to crash over him with the violence of a physical blow. The knuckles of his hand turned a stark, bone white as his grip tightened for one agonizing microsecond before he released her entirely. The withdrawal was so sudden, so violently abrupt, that Hermione actually swayed forward, deprived of the anchor. He took a massive step back, swallowing the distance between himself and the opposite wall. The tactile friction that had crackled between them just moments before instantly froze over, replaced by a wall of glacial, suffocating ice. "Watch your footing, Granger," he clipped out. His voice was entirely devoid of the ragged breathlessness from a moment ago. It was a flat, deadened drawl that echoed harshly in the vacant corridor. "I have no desire to spend the rest of my evening hauling you out of booby traps because you're too busy staring at the masonry to notice a rudimentary trigger line." The whiplash of his change in demeanor struck her squarely in the chest. A hot, prickling wave of indignation rushed up her neck, burning away the lingering ghost of his touch. She instantly straightened her spine, her hands moving in a frantic, jerky motion to smooth the front of her robes, desperately needing to reclaim her composure. "I was perfectly aware of the trigger line, Malfoy," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it into a realm of icy academic authority. "The structural integrity of the castle is compromising the stability of lingering curses. The interference from the cracked stone altered the wand movement required to dismantle it safely." "Clearly," he muttered, turning his back to her. He ignited his wand with a sharp, wordless flick. The cold, silver light bathed the corridor once more, illuminating the rigid, unforgiving line of his shoulders. "Keep up. The library is next on the schedule, and I intend to finish this patrol before the sun rises." He didn't wait for her response, his long strides eating up the distance down the hall. Hermione stood frozen for a moment, her nails biting half-moons into her palms. The sheer audacity of him, the exhausting, relentless oscillation between the boy who had just thrown himself between her and a magical explosion, and the boy who now spoke to her as if she were a particularly irritating stain on the floorboards. She forced her breathing to steady, adjusting her headgirl badge with a sharp tug, and followed the hollow echo of his footsteps into the gloom. The journey to the ground floor was steeped in a thick, suffocating silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping castle. It was an active, combative stillness. The air between them hummed with a severe static, a physical boundary they both stubbornly refused to cross. When they finally pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Hogwarts library, the scent of the space wrapped around them, a familiar, comforting blend of the tooth of old parchment, leather bindings, and the dry, settling dust of centuries of magic. Moonlight sliced through the tall, arched windows, casting elongated, skeletal shadows across the rows of towering bookshelves. Hermione moved to the right, sweeping her wand light over the reading tables, searching for the telltale signs of students lingering past curfew. Malfoy took the left aisle, his silver light gliding silently over the spines of the restricted section. They worked in a strange, silent synchronization. Despite the icy chasm he had thrown between them, there was an undeniable, visceral alignment in how they moved through the space. When she paused at an intersection, he paused at his. When she checked behind a heavy tapestry, he naturally covered the blind spot opposite her. It was a fluid, tactical dance, born of a shared, hyper-vigilant survival instinct, cultivated during a war they had spent on opposite sides. "Granger." His voice was low, barely more than a murmur, but it carried through the quiet of the library with razor-sharp clarity. Hermione turned, navigating through the labyrinth of shelves until she found him standing near the iron-wrought gates of the restricted section. He was staring at the heavy padlock, his wand illuminated. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her distance, the memory of his previous sharp withdrawal keeping her rigidly on guard. "The ward," he said softly. He didn't look at her, His pale eyes were tracking an invisible pattern in the air just above the lock. Someone has been tampering with it. It's unspooled. If we leave it, the alarms will trigger the moment Madame Pince opens the doors tomorrow morning. Hermione stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she focused her magical sight. He was right. The complex lattice of golden magical threads that usually secured the gate was frayed, several strands hanging loose and vibrating with an unstable hum. It requires a dual binding, she noted, her professional academic tones slipping back into place like a protective shield. One to stabilize the base, the other to reweave the secondary security charm. I can handle the weave if you anchor the base. Malfoy gave that same fraction of a nod, his jaw tight. He raised his wand, his silver ring glinting sharply in the moonlight. On 3. They didn't count out loud. They didn't need to. The magnetic pull of their shared focus dictated the timing perfectly. On the silent third beat, Malfoy murmured a deep, guttural incantation, a stream of heavy, grounding silver magic pouring from his wand to grip the frayed edges of the ward. Instantly, Hermione stepped in, her vinewood wand dancing in rapid, precise arcs. She chanted under her breath, a complicated, weaving spell that spun pure white light around his silver anchor. The magic twisted together, silver and white intertwining, fighting for dominance before settling into a harmonious, glowing chord. For a profound, suspended minute, they were entirely connected by the magic. Hermione could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his magical core pressing against hers, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in her chest. She glanced up from the lock. Malfoy was already looking at her. In the glow of their combined spellwork, the harsh angles of his face were softened. The icy detachment in his eyes had melted, revealing a profound, cavernous exhaustion. He looked incredibly young, incredibly burdened. For a fleeting second, the walls were entirely down, and she saw the fractured, deeply scarred boy beneath the venomous exterior. Her breath caught in her throat. The static in the air transformed into a soft, terrifying warmth. Blinked, stepping back hastily. His wand blinked, stepping back hastily, his wand lowering. As he moved, his hand brushed against the pocket of his robes, and a thick, folded piece of parchment dislodged, fluttering silently to the stone floor. Hermione's eyes dropped to the floor. Before she could think better of it, she knelt and picked it up. Her fingers grazed the heavy, oppressive purple wax seal of the Ministry of Magic. The emblem of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, specifically the Probationary Oversight Committee, was stamped starkly across the front. The warmth in the air evaporated instantly, sucked into a freezing vacuum. "Give that to me." His voice wasn't loud, but it was laced with a lethal, panicked venom. Hermione looked up, the parchment heavy in her hand. Malfoy's face had drained of all colour, leaving him looking like a marble statue. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped his wand, his chest heaving with sudden, restrained panic. "Malfoy, She started, her voice softening involuntarily, an instinctual wave of empathy rising in her chest. She took a half step toward him, extending her hand to return the letter. "I said, give it to me," he hissed, closing the distance between them with a violent, jagged step. He snatched the parchment from her fingers, the sudden friction of his snatching movement burning her skin. He shoved the letter deep into his pocket, his breathing ragged, his eyes flashing with a defensive, cornered cruelty. The vulnerability she had just witnessed was utterly eradicated, replaced by a sneer that twisted his features into a mask of pure, self-loathing arrogance. "Don't look at me like that, Granger," he spat, his voice trembling with a barely suppressed rage that was entirely directed inward. "Save your insufferable Gryffindor pity for someone who wants it. Or were you just checking to make sure the Ministry's leash is tight enough on the stray Death Eater?" The words struck her like a physical blow, cruel and entirely unprovoked. The tentative trust, the fleeting warmth of their shared magic, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I was just picking it up," she whispered, her own walls slamming down violently in response. The betrayal stung her eyes, a sharp, bitter prickle she adamantly refused to let fall. "You dropped it!" He stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily, a muscle in his jaw ticking wildly. He looked as though he wanted to say something else, to hurl another barb to ensure the distance between them was impassable. Instead, he simply turned on his heel. "The library is clear," he said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, hollow and dead. "Patrol is over." He walked away, his dark robes swallowing the moonlight, leaving her standing alone in the shadows, the bite of the cold air rushing in to fill the massive void he left behind. For 3 agonizing weeks following the incident in the library, the space between the head boy and head girl was defined by a profound, suffocating frost. The conflict they were supposedly managing, the daily administration of a traumatized student body, paled in comparison to the silent, brutal war of attrition they waged against one another. They did not argue. They did not exchange barbs in the corridors or sneer across the great hall. Instead, they weaponized their silence. It was an active, heavy void. When Hermione entered the shared head office, the atmospheric pressure would immediately plummet, the air growing so dense it felt difficult to pull into her lungs. If Draco was seated at the dark mahogany desk, his quill would cease its scratching. He wouldn't look up. He would simply freeze, his posture adopting the rigid, unyielding lines of a marble effigy until she gathered her parchment and left. In the great hall, if their gazes accidentally intersected over the sea of students, his pale eyes would immediately shutter, dropping to his plate with a jarring impact that felt entirely physical to her. Hermione compensated by tightening her grip on her duties. She spent hours meticulously color-coding patrol schedules, her fingers constantly seeking the familiar grounding edge of her headgirl badge whenever she felt the terrifying unbidden urge to ask him about the ministry letter. She refused to let his defensive cruelty dictate her equilibrium. Yet, every time she adjusted her perfectly starched cuffs, a phantom heat ghosted over her upper arm where his hand had clamped down in the dark. The tactile friction of his memory was impossible to scrub away. The illusion of their mutual indifference shattered on a late Tuesday in November. The storm did not arrive with a gentle warning. It swallowed the Scottish Highlands in a matter of minutes. The sky above the Black Lake bruised into a violent, unnatural purple, heavy with the scent of ozone and impending destruction. By dinner time, the wind was howling like a legion of banshees against the ancient stones of the castle. The owlery. Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the nervous chatter of the great hall, her stern gaze fixing directly on Hermione and Draco as a particularly vicious crack of thunder rattled the enchanted ceiling. The southern shutters have been ripped from their latches. The birds are entirely exposed. Secure it immediately. They stood simultaneously. There was no time for hesitation, no room for their glacial avoidance. As they left the warmth of the hall and sprinted toward the west tower, the temperature in the corridors plummeted. The hollow echo of their synchronized footsteps was swallowed by the deafening roar of the gale outside. By the time they reached the spiraling, uneven stone steps of the owlery, they were both breathless. Hermione pushed the heavy, iron-bound door open, and the storm violently invaded the castle. The circular room was a scene of absolute chaos. Rain drove through the shattered southern windows in horizontal sheets, soaking the straw-covered floor and turning the air into a freezing, misty soup. Hundreds of owls shrieked and fluttered in a panicked frenzy, their feathers plastered to their bodies, desperately seeking refuge in the higher sheltered alcoves. The scent of wet feathers, raw earth, and the metallic tang of lightning was overwhelming. "The main latch is completely sheared off," Hermione yelled over the deafening roar of the wind, her voice tearing from her throat. She fought against the gale, her robes whipping violently around her legs as she threw her weight against the heavy wooden shutter, trying to force it closed against the tempest. It wouldn't budge. The wind possessed the strength of a solid, unyielding wall. A dark shape materialized beside her. Draco didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He simply slammed his shoulder against the opposite side of the thick wood, his boots slipping momentarily on the slick, wet stone before finding purchase. "On my mark!" he shouted, his voice a harsh, commanding scrape that cut through the thunder. He drew his wand, the pale wood a stark contrast against his black, rain-soaked leather gloves. "I'll cast a localized vacuum to break the wind's resistance. You slam the locking charm on the hinges." Hermione nodded blindly, rain stinging her eyes, her own wand raised and trembling with adrenaline. The visceral alignment of their magic, dormant since the library, flared to life with terrifying immediacy. "Now!" Draco slashed his wand in a brutal, sweeping arc. For a fraction of a second, the roaring wind died in a pocket of absolute, vacuum-sealed silence. Hermione lunged forward, pressing both hands against the wet wood, her vinewood wand sparking furiously as she shrieked, "Colloportus!" The heavy shutter slammed into the stone frame with a deafening crack. Golden light flared violently around the iron hinges, searing the wood shut just as the wind slammed back against it with renewed, furious vengeance. The wood groaned, but the magical seal held. They stumbled backward, away from the window, gasping for air. The sudden cessation of the horizontal rain left the owlery plunged into a deep, murky gloom, lit only by the erratic strobe-light flashes of lightning through the remaining high windows. Hermione leaned against a dry stretch of the curving stone wall, her chest heaving. She was soaked to the bone. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks and neck, and a violent shiver ripped through her spine, rattling her teeth. The adrenaline was rapidly draining, leaving behind the biting, icy reality of November in the Scottish Highlands. Across the small space, Draco stood near the center of the room. His headboy cloak was heavy with water, dripping steadily onto the stone floor. He had stripped off his gloves, his bare hands pale and stark in the dim light. He ran a shaking hand through his soaked platinum hair, pushing it back from his forehead. He looked entirely hollowed out. The rigid marble facade he had worn for 3 weeks was gone, stripped away by the physical exertion and the raw power of the storm. He was just a boy, freezing and exhausted in the dark. Hermione wrapped her arms tightly around her waist, her fingernails digging into the damp wool of her sleeves, trying to suppress another violent tremor. She needed to cast a warming charm, but her fingers were too numb, her wand slipping precariously in her grip. In the shadows, Draco's head snapped up. The sound of her teeth chattering, however faint, had reached him. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. It was no longer dictated by the storm outside. It was entirely generated by the magnetic pull between them. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, then another. Hermione's breath hitched, catching painfully in her throat. She pressed her spine harder against the stone, a frantic flutter of panic and entirely inappropriate anticipation rising in her chest. She prepared herself for the inevitable coldness, for him to sneer at her weakness or mock her inability to cast a basic charm. He stopped less than a foot away, the heat radiating off his body despite his soaked clothes was a palpable force in the freezing room. He didn't speak. He simply raised his wand. The knuckles of his hand were stark white, and she could see a fine, betraying tremor travelling up his forearm. His pale eyes, usually guarded by impenetrable shields, were entirely exposed, dark and stormy in the low light. He pointed his wand slightly to the left of her shoulder and muttered a soft, complex incantation under his breath. A wave of thick, golden heat poured from the tip of his wand, washing over her like a heavy, protective blanket. The biting cold was instantly banished from her skin, the dampness in her robes evaporating into a faint wisp of steam. Hermione stared up at him, her lips parted in shock. The urge to straighten her cuffs vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, terrifying stillness. "You're shaking, Granger," he murmured. His voice was incredibly low, a raspy whisper that barely carried over the muffled roar of the wind outside. It wasn't an insult. It was a raw, devastatingly vulnerable observation. "So, are you?" she breathed back. He didn't step away. The gap between them was so narrow, she could smell the rain clinging to his skin, mixed with the sharp, clean scent of bergamot and the unique, crackling static of his magical core. The tension was no longer a wall. It was a physical tether, pulling them inexorably toward a center point. Draco's gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth. The muscle in his jaw feathered rapidly. He leaned in, just a fraction of an inch, but the movement was monumental. The shadow of his eyelashes fell across his cheekbones. Hermione could feel the erratic, shallow puffs of his breath against her skin. The world outside the owlery ceased to exist. There was only the stone at her back, the heat of his magic wrapping around her, and the devastating, heavy inevitability of his proximity. She tilted her chin up, an instinctual, terrifying surrender. Her eyes fluttered shut. She waited for the final fraction of an inch to close, her heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Crack! A massive branch, ripped from a tree in the forbidden forest, slammed violently against the reinforced shutters they had just sealed. The wood shrieked, a deafening, terrifying sound that reverberated through the stone floor and straight up their spines. Draco flinched violently, as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He stumbled backward, a harsh gasp tearing from his throat. The visceral alignment shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Hermione snapped her eyes open, her hand flying to her chest, the phantom heat of his almost touch rapidly turning to ash. When she looked at him, the boy who had just carefully cast a warming charm over her was gone. The marble effigy was back, slammed into place with terrifying speed. His chest was heaving, his pale eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating panic, not of the storm, but of what he had almost allowed himself to do. The rot of his own perceived unworthiness, the deep-seated fear that he would corrupt anything he touched, manifested instantly in the rigid, defensive line of his shoulders. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The repulsion was absolute and devastating. Draco turned on his heel, his damp cloak sweeping heavily against the floor, and marched toward the heavy oak door. He wrenched it open, stepping out into the freezing stairwell without a backward glance, leaving Hermione standing alone in the dark, the echo of the storm deafening in the wake of his freezing silence. The grey, watery light of a battered November morning bled through the mullioned windows of the head dormitory. Hermione sat at the absolute edge of her four-poster bed, staring blankly at the perfectly aligned emerald and crimson threads of the woven rug. Her muscles ached with a dull, throbbing protest, a lingering physiological reminder of the violent winds in the owlery. But the physical soreness was entirely eclipsed by the heavy, suffocating weight pressing against her ribs. The memory of the previous night was a jagged piece of glass she could not stop turning over in her mind. The enveloping heat of his magic, the erratic, shallow puffs of his breath against her skin, the terrifying, undeniable magnetic pull that had drawn them across the boundary of their mutual animosity. And then, the jarring impact of his withdrawal. The way his eyes had widened with pure, unfiltered panic before the ice had slammed back into place, freezing her out completely. She inhaled deeply, the air in her private room tasting metallic and thin. She refused to be a victim to his erratic, punishing shifts in temperature. She stood, her movements sharp and deliberate. She dressed meticulously, her fingers flying over the buttons of her white blouse. When she reached for her headgirl badge, she pinned it to her robes with a harsh, definitive prick of the needle. It was armor. She smoothed her cuffs, ensuring the white edges were rigidly parallel to the dark wool of her sleeves, constructing the impenetrable facade of the brightest witch of her age. When Hermione pushed open the heavy door to their shared common room, the atmospheric pressure in the space plummeted so rapidly her ears popped. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, bruised stillness. A fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, casting long, wavering shadows across the dark mahogany furniture. Draco was already there. He was seated at the far end of the long study table, fully dressed in his stark black robes, his posture possessing the rigid, unyielding lines of a marble pillar. He did not look up when the door clicked shut behind her. The only sound in the room was the harsh, rhythmic scratch of his eagle feather quill against a roll of thick parchment. He was entirely consumed by the task, his jaw locked, his pale hair falling forward to obscure his eyes. Yet, the air between them hummed with a severe static. It was the tactile friction of two people, hyper-aware of each other's presence, violently pretending otherwise. Hermione walked to the small kitchenette alcove, her sensible shoes clicking a precise, unhurried rhythm against the stone floor. She filled the copper kettle, the mundane splashing of water echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. She could smell the sharp, bitter aroma of the black coffee he must have brewed hours ago, mixed with the faint, lingering scent of bergamot that instantly tightened her throat. The structural damage report for the West Tower requires a dual signature, Hermione said. Her voice was perfectly leveled, stripped of any tremor or hesitance. It was the tone she reserved for challenging professors. The scratching of his quills ceased. A microsecond of absolute stillness stretched between them. Then, without turning his head, Draco extended his left hand across the polished wood of the table. His fingers were long, pale, and completely steady. The silver ring on his index finger caught the meager light from the fire. Hermione picked up the rolled parchment from her satchel and crossed the room. She approached him the way one might approach a volatile magical creature, with measured steps and entirely guarded breathing. She held out the parchment. He took it. For a fraction of a second, the edge of the heavy paper dragged against the space between their hands. The distance was less than an inch, yet the magnetic pull was agonizingly dense, a localized gravity well attempting to force a visceral alignment. They were both fighting with every ounce of their willpower. Draco's knuckles whitened instantly. He snatched the parchment with a sharp, clipped motion, breaking the invisible tether. "I will review it," he murmured. His voice was a flat, deadened drawl, entirely devoid of the raspy vulnerability from the owlery. It was the voice of a Malfoy addressing an inconvenience. Hermione's fingernails bit into the soft flesh of her palms. The sheer, suffocating arrogance of his defense mechanism sparked a hot, prickling wave of indignation at the base of her neck. He was burying the reality of last night under a mountain of glacial indifference, and he expected her to simply freeze alongside him. She didn't retreat to the kitchenette. She remained standing beside his chair, looking down at the rigid line of his shoulders. The charms corridor on the 3rd floor is still leaking residual magic from the stabilizing charms we placed last week. I've scheduled a secondary sweep for our patrol tonight. Draco finally looked up. His pale eyes were heavily shuttered, the impenetrable occlumency shields rendering them the color of flat, frozen slate. The dark smudges beneath his lower lashes were the only visible betrayal of his exhaustion. "Reassign it to the Ravenclaw prefects," he instructed, his tone clipped. "I have no intention of wasting another evening babysitting crumbling masonry." "The prefects do not have the clearance to dismantle layered wards, Malfoy," she countered, her chin tilting up defensively. "It is our responsibility." "Then do it yourself, Granger." He dropped his gaze back to his desk, unrolling the damage report with a sharp flick of his wrist. "You revel in proving you are the only competent witch in the castle. Consider this an opportunity to shine." The cruelty in his voice was not hot. It was absolute zero. It was a calculated, deliberate attempt to force repulsion, to push her so far away she would never dare to cross the boundary line again. Hermione's chest tightened. She watched the way his left hand subtly shifted, his fingers drifting to rest heavily over his right forearm, right above the dark mark hidden beneath layers of wool and cotton. It was an unconscious gesture, a physical manifestation of the heavy, suffocating guilt he carried. He truly believed he was a contaminant. He was weaponizing his cruelty to keep her safe from the wreckage of his own life. The realization did not soften her anger. It sharpened it into a piercing, focused blade. "You cannot dictate the temperature of every room we occupy," she said softly. The words hung in the quiet air, stripping away the academic pretense of their conversation. Draco's hand froze over his sleeve. The muscle in his jaw feathered violently. He slowly placed his quill down on the table, the metallic nib clicking sharply against the wood. He pushed his chair back and stood up. Because of his height, the movement instantly swallowed the space between them. The atmospheric pressure became a crushing physical weight. He looked down at her, the mask of indifference cracking just enough to reveal the frantic, cornered storm raging underneath. "I am dictating nothing," he breathed, his voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous scrape. "I am simply attempting to exist in this castle without your relentless, insufferable need to psychoanalyze every shadow." "I am not analyzing you, Malfoy. I am trying to complete a patrol schedule." Hermione held her ground, refusing to step back, even as the scent of winter frost and dark magic rolled off his robes, making her head spin. "But your inability to maintain a consistent professional demeanor is making it impossible." "Professional?" A dark, bitter laugh tore from his throat, devoid of any actual humor. He leaned in, the visceral alignment snapping back into place with terrifying speed. His eyes locked onto hers, burning with a sudden, localized heat. "You want professional, Granger? Fine. Leave the parchment on the desk, do your rounds, and stay on your side of the corridor." "Stop treating me like a fragile piece of glass," she fired back, her voice trembling with the sheer force of her suppressed emotions. "I survived a war. I can survive a drafty corridor, and I can certainly survive you." The words struck him like a physical blow. A brutal, agonizing flinch rippled through his entire body. The knuckles of his hands, resting on the edge of the table, turned bone white. For one suspended, terrifying second, the magnetic pull flared so violently, Hermione thought he might bridge the gap. She saw the desperate, starving look in his eyes. A fractured boy standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down at the only person who had ever reached out to him. Then, the survival instinct took over. The terror of his own perceived corruption won. He violently severed the tether. Draco stepped back, the repulsion absolute and devastating. His face slammed shut, returning to the impenetrable, freezing marble. "You shouldn't have to," he whispered. It was the most honest, devastating thing he had ever said to her. The raw vulnerability in the quiet admission sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Before Hermione could formulate a response, before she could process the sheer weight of his self-condemnation, Draco turned on his heel. He grabbed his heavy winter cloak from the back of the chair and strode toward the portrait hole. He didn't look back. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind him with a definitive, echoing thud. The draft from the closing door caught the edge of the damage report he had left on the desk. The thick parchment fluttered, sliding silently across the polished mahogany before dropping over the edge, landing on the cold stone floor with a quiet, dismissive rustle. Hermione stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the heavy, agonizing static of his absence, the phantom heat of his proximity still burning a brand into her skin. December descended upon the Scottish Highlands, not with a gentle dusting of white, but with a brutal, biting ferocity. The temperature inside the castle plummeted, turning the stone corridors into echoing iceboxes and painting the inside of the mullioned windows with thick, jagged spiderwebs of frost. The draught that constantly swept through the 7th floor no longer felt like a mere nuisance. It was a physical entity, a freezing phantom that clawed at the edges of Hermione's woolen cloak every time she stepped out of the head dormitory. The silence between her and Draco had hardened into something crystalline and absolute. Since the explosive confrontation in their common room, their shared existence had become a masterpiece of avoidance. They communicated strictly through annotations on patrol logs, their handwriting rigid and impersonal. If they happened to occupy the same room, the atmospheric pressure would immediately condense into a suffocating density, a kinetic charge so heavy it made the simple act of inhaling feel like a monumental effort. Tonight, the patrol schedule dictated a sweep of the 5th floor eastern wing, a notoriously dilapidated section of the castle that had sustained heavy curses during the battle. Hermione walked alone, the pale beam of her lumos cutting a fragile path through the abyssal dark. The hollow echo of her sensible shoes against the flagstones was the only sound, a lonely, rhythmic metronome counting down the hours until dawn. She turned the corner near the statue of Boris the Bewildered, the scent of deteriorating canvas and ancient, settled dust rising from the tapestries. As she passed a narrow, deeply shadowed alcove, a strange sensation prickled the back of her neck. It wasn't the ambient cold of the corridor. It was a localized drop in temperature, accompanied by a faint, dissonant hum that vibrated directly against her teeth. Hermione slowed her pace, her fingers tightening around her vinewood wand. She stepped into the alcove, her wand light sweeping over the uneven masonry. At the very back, completely obscured from the main corridor, a heavy oak door stood ajar by a mere fraction of an inch. A faint, sickly violet glow pulsed from the crack, spilling out onto the stone floor like poisoned water. She pushed the door open. The iron hinges shrieked in protest, a violent, grating sound that shattered the quiet of the night. The room was a forgotten classroom, the desks piled haphazardly into a towering, splintered mountain in the corner. But Hermione's eyes were not drawn to the debris. In the very center of the room, suspended 3 feet above the floorboards, a sphere of condensed, swirling dark magic hung in the air. It was a dormant, cursed snare, a leftover trap from the Death Eaters who had breached the castle walls months ago. And standing less than an arm's length from it was Draco Malfoy. He had his back to her, his tall frame entirely motionless. He had removed his headboy cloak, leaving him in only his crisp white shirt and dark trousers. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows. The stark, black ink of the dark mark was barely visible on his left forearm, a shadow against his pale skin. But its phantom weight seemed to drag his entire posture downward. The jarring impact of finding him here, alone and unguarded with a volatile curse, sent a sharp spike of adrenaline straight through Hermione's chest. The air in the room was impossibly thin, thick with the metallic scent of ozone and the sharp, clean bite of his winter frost magical signature. Malfoy, she breathed, the words slipping out before she could construct her usual armor of academic authority. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn around. The only indication that he had heard her was the sudden, violent tightening of his right hand around his wand. The knuckles turned a stark bone white, the tendons in his forearms standing out in sharp relief. "Get out, Granger," he commanded. His voice was a harsh, raspy scrape, completely devoid of his usual icy drawl. It sounded ragged, as if it had been dragged over broken glass. "That is a Class 4 containment snare." She stepped fully into the room, her Gryffindor stubbornness overriding the sheer, terrifying static vibrating between them. "It's highly unstable. The auras were supposed to clear this sector weeks ago. You shouldn't be near it without a stabilizing tether." "I am perfectly aware of what it is," he murmured, his gaze locked onto the pulsing violet sphere. "I watched it being cast. Now, turn around and walk out the door." Hermione's breath hitched. The quiet admission hung in the freezing air, heavy with a suffocating, unbearable guilt. He was torturing himself. He was actively seeking out the remnants of his darkest mistakes, standing in the literal and metaphorical wreckage of his past, punishing himself in the empty hours of the night. A hot, prickling wave of empathy, a dangerous, treacherous emotion she had sworn to suppress, rose in her throat. She ignored his command. She took 3 deliberate steps forward, closing the distance until she was standing just behind his right shoulder. The tactile friction between them was instantaneous and overwhelming. The heat radiating off his body was a shocking contrast to the ambient, freezing temperature of the room. "You cannot dismantle it alone," Hermione said softly, her voice dropping to a low, steady register. "The magical signature requires a dual-feed countercurse. If you try to force it with only your magic, the snare will rupture. It will tear the masonry apart, and you with it." Draco finally turned his head. The violet light illuminated the sharp angles of his face, casting deep, hollow shadows beneath his cheekbones. His pale eyes were entirely stripped of their impenetrable occlumency shields. They were stormy, turbulent, and filled with a desperate, starving exhaustion that made her own heart stutter in its rhythm. "Why are you so relentlessly determined to stand in the blast radius, Granger?" he whispered, his jaw feathering. "I told you to stay on your side of the corridor." "Because you are standing in front of a bomb," she fired back, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to let him retreat into his self-loathing. "And I am not going to let you detonate it just because you think you deserve the shrapnel." A brutal, agonizing flinch rippled through his shoulders. He closed his eyes, a ragged exhale tearing from his chest. The space between them collapsed further, the magnetic pull becoming an absolute, undeniable physical force. Suddenly, the sphere of dark magic emitted a high-pitched whining frequency. The violet light flared violently, reacting to the sudden surge of highly charged emotional energy in the room. The heavy oak door behind Hermione slammed shut with a deafening crack, the sound echoing like a gunshot. A lattice of glowing purple thread shot across the doorframe, sealing them inside. Hermione spun around, her wand snapping up instantly, but the ward was already solid. The room's temperature plummeted further, the air growing brittle and sharp. "It feeds on magical resonance," Draco said, his voice instantly shifting from ragged vulnerability into a hyper-focused, lethal calm. The transition was terrifyingly fast. "Triggered the secondary defense mechanism. Triggered the secondary defense mechanism. It's locking us in to drain our cores." Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at Hermione's throat. She stared at the pulsing sphere. "The dual-feed countercurse. We have to cast it simultaneously, or the vacuum will compress. The incantation requires a synchronized wand movement, a perfect figure 8 inverted on the downstroke, he instructed, his eyes locked on the snare. Can you do it? Yes. She swallowed hard, fighting the tremor in her fingers. She raised her vinewood wand, pointing it at the sphere. Draco raised his own wand, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. But the angle was wrong. The snare was expanding, the violet light growing blinding. To weave the spells perfectly together, their wand tips needed to be mere inches apart, their magical flows completely aligned. He hesitated for a microsecond. The muscle in his jaw ticked violently. Then he stepped completely behind her. The visceral alignment was a jarring impact that knocked the breath straight from her lungs. He was impossibly close. His broad chest hovered millimeters from her back, the heat of his body searing right through the thick layers of her winter cloak. He reached his right arm around her, aligning his pale hawthorn wand parallel to hers. "Keep your arms steady," he murmured. His lips were right next to her ear, his breath a warm, ghosting touch against the sensitive skin of her neck. The sharp scent of bergamot and crackling static completely overwhelmed her senses. "Follow my pacing." Hermione squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, desperately trying to quiet the frantic, desperate drumming of her heart. She was surrounded by him. The boy who was supposed to be her enemy, the boy who had thrown cruel, freezing words at her just days ago, was now acting as her literal shield against a dark curse. "On 3, he whispered. She opened her eyes, fixing her gaze on the deadly sphere. She nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. 1, 2, 3. They moved. Hermione began the intricate figure 8, her voice ringing out clearly in the freezing room, chanting the ancient Latin countercurse. Simultaneously, Draco's deep, guttural voice wove beneath hers, reciting the stabilizing anchor incantation. Their wands moved in perfect, mirrored synchronization. A stream of pure, blinding white light erupted from Hermione's wand, twisting immediately around a heavy, grounding cord of silver magic that poured from Draco's. The snare fought back. A wave of localized pressure pushed against them, heavy and suffocating. Hermione's arm trembled under the strain. The magic was too heavy, too resistant. The white light began to sputter. Suddenly, Draco's left hand came up. He didn't grab her arm or her wrist. Instead, his long, pale fingers slid over the back of her hand, completely covering her knuckles. The cold bite of his silver ring pressed into her skin, but his palm was scorching hot. He adjusted her grip, shifting her wand angle upward by a fraction of a degree. The physical contact was a visceral shock to her system. The static in the air exploded into a brilliant, rushing warmth. The moment his skin touched hers, the silver and white magic perfectly fused into an unbreakable, glowing lasso. It shot forward, wrapping around the violet sphere with a definitive, ringing crack. The snare shrieked, a terrible, tearing sound, and then imploded. The dark magic dissolved into a shower of harmless grey ash that drifted slowly to the floorboards. The purple lattice sealing the door vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. Hermione's chest heaved, her wand hand dropping to her side. Draco's hand was still covering hers. The heat of his chest was still pressed against her back. For 10 agonizing, suspended heartbeats, neither of them moved. The danger was gone, but the electric resonance tethering them together was stronger than ever. She could feel the rapid, frantic rise and fall of his chest against her spine. She turned her head just slightly. Malfoy. The soft sound of his name breaking the silence was the catalyst. The survival instinct, the terror of his own perceived corruption, slammed back into him with terrifying force. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned. The withdrawal was violent, a complete and absolute severing of the tether. He took 2 massive steps backward, putting a vast, freezing expanse of empty air between them. Hermione spun around to face him. The marble mask had returned, rigid and impenetrable. His eyes were shuttered, entirely devoid of the vulnerability she had seen just moments before. He was already rolling down his sleeves, his fingers moving with frantic, jerky precision to hide the mark on his forearm, to hide the physical proof of the guilt that commanded his every move. "The sector is clear," he said. His voice was completely flat, entirely deadened. It was a freezing gust of wind that instantly extinguished the lingering warmth in the room. He didn't wait for her to speak. He didn't look at her face. He turned and walked out the open door, his footsteps fading rapidly into the abyssal dark of the corridor, leaving her surrounded by a shower of grey ash and the devastating, heavy ache of his abrupt absence. The great hall was a masterpiece of mid-December enchantment, draped in heavy garlands of silver-tipped holly and illuminated by thousands of floating, crystalline spheres that cast a warm, fractured light over the student body. The scent of roasted chestnuts, melting beeswax, and fresh pine needles saturated the air, a thick, festive blanket meant to smother the lingering anxieties of the post-war year. Yet, sitting at the very edge of the Gryffindor table, Hermione Granger felt entirely insulated from the warmth. The chill that gripped her had nothing to do with the snow piling against the high arched windows. It was an internal, creeping frost, a direct physiological response to the vast, empty void Draco Malfoy had violently carved between them since the incident in the 5th floor corridor. For 10 days, his withdrawal had been absolute. It was not the passive avoidance of their early patrols. It was an active, aggressive erasure of his presence from her orbit. If she entered the library, he would seamlessly gather his books and exit through the opposite archway before she even had the chance to unbutton her winter cloak. If their patrol routes threatened to intersect, he manipulated the schedules with a ruthless, silent efficiency to ensure they remained on entirely different floors. Hermione traced the rim of her golden goblet, her fingernail lightly scraping the metal. Across the vast expanse of the hall, at the far end of the Slytherin table, he sat entirely still. He was not engaging with the quiet murmurs of his housemates. He stared blankly at his untouched plate, the rigid, unyielding lines of his profile resembling a statue carved from glacial ice. The magnetic pull between them, however, ignored the physical distance. It hummed through the cavernous room, a taut, vibrating wire of static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She was exhausted. The constant, draining exertion of pretending the air around her wasn't heavy with his absence was taking a severe toll. The phantom weight of his palm pressing over her knuckles, the searing heat of his chest against her spine as they dismantled the dark snare. These sensory memories refused to fade. They burned a permanent brand into her awareness, making his current freezing silence agonizing to endure. That evening, the Yule holiday protocols required their mandatory presence in the head office. A dual signature from the head boy and a dual signature from the head boy and head girl. When Hermione pushed open the heavy oak door, the atmospheric pressure in the small circular room was already suffocatingly dense. Draco was seated behind the massive mahogany desk, his head boy badge gleaming sharply against the dark wool of his robes. The fire in the hearth was roaring, yet the space felt bitterly cold. He did not look up. He simply slid a thick stack of parchment across the polished wood toward the empty chair opposite him, the harsh scrape of the paper echoing loudly in the tense quiet. Hermione didn't sit down. She unclasped her cloak, hanging it deliberately on the iron hook near the door, her movements slow and exact. She walked to the desk, standing directly across from him. The visceral alignment of their opposing wills instantly flared, a kinetic charge that made the air taste metallic. She picked up the eagle feather quill lying beside the documents, dipped it into the black ink, and began to sign her name. The tooth of the old parchment caught the nib, creating a rhythmic scratching sound. When she reached the final page, she paused. "You missed the authorization line for the astronomy tower access," Hermione stated, her voice perfectly leveled, stripped of any academic pretense. It was quiet, but it pierced the silence like a silver needle. Draco's jaw locked. The muscle just beneath his ear feathered violently. He extended his left hand, the silver ring on his index finger catching the firelight. He expected her to simply slide the paper back to him. Hermione didn't move the parchment. Instead, she kept her hand resting firmly on the edge of the document, her fingers pale against the dark wood. He waited for a microsecond. Then, forced by her stubborn stillness, he raised his eyes. The impenetrable occlumency shields were firmly in place, turning his irises into flat, frozen slates. But the dark, bruised exhaustion beneath his lower lashes betrayed the immense effort it took to maintain the facade. "The parchment, Granger," he murmured, a flat, deadened drawl that attempted to enforce the boundary line between them. "You act as though making eye contact will incinerate you, Malfoy," she replied softly, refusing to relinquish her hold on the document. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The raw honesty in her tone was far more devastating than anger. A brutal, agonizing flinch rippled through his shoulders. His fingers, hovering over the desk, curled inward, his knuckles turning stark white. "Perhaps I simply have no desire to engage in a conversation that isn't strictly mandated by our stations." "Stop it," she breathed. The command was laced with a sudden, overwhelming weariness that stripped away the last of her Gryffindor armor. She let go of the parchment and took a step around the side of the desk, deliberately invading the freezing space he had constructed around himself. "Stop pretending that what happens when we are in the same room is just a figment of my imagination. Stop punishing yourself for something that hasn't even happened." Draco stood up so violently, his heavy wooden chair scraped painfully against the stone floor. Because of the confined space behind the desk, her proximity trapped him. He towered over her, the sudden vertical shift causing the atmospheric pressure to drop completely out of the room. "You have no idea what I am punishing myself for," he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous scrape. The marble mask was cracking, fracturing under the relentless weight of her perception. He turned his body slightly, a physical manifestation of his desperate need to retreat. But the edge of the desk blocked him. "I know that you threw yourself between me and a blasted curse in the corridor." Hermione fired back, tilting her chin up, refusing to back down from the localized storm raging in his eyes. "I know that you cast a warming charm on me when my own fingers were too numb to hold a wand. And I know that in the 5th floor classroom you guided my hand instead of letting the snare tear us apart. You are terrifyingly desperate to convince me that you are dangerous, Malfoy, but your actions constantly betray you." The words struck him with a jarring impact. He sucked in a ragged, uneven breath, his chest heaving beneath the dark wool of his robes. The sharp, clean scent of winter frost and bergamot rolled off him in heavy waves, intoxicating and deeply familiar. "You survived a war, Granger," he whispered, his tone trembling with a raw, bleeding vulnerability that entirely shattered his defenses. He leaned forward, bracing both hands on the edge of the desk, the veins in his forearms standing out in stark relief. "You survived, Bellatrix. You survived the mud and the blood, and the absolute worst of what my family stood for. You are pure, unrelenting light." He closed his eyes, a devastating look of self-condemnation twisting his features. His left hand moved, his fingers gripping his right forearm, directly over the hidden mark, pressing so hard the knuckles bone white. "And I am a shadow," he continued, the words tearing from his throat like broken glass. "I am stained. Every time I get close to you, every time I let myself forget the reality of what I am, I risk pulling you into the dark with me. I will not tarnish you just because I am starving for something I do not deserve." The heavy, suffocating silence that followed his confession was the most honest moment that had ever passed between them. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a defensive barb. It was the terrified, fractured core of his guilt laid entirely bare. He wasn't withdrawing because he despised her. He was withdrawing because he believed his touch was poison. Hermione's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. The overwhelming urge to fix her cuffs, to retreat into logic and order, completely vanished. The tactile friction between them reached a fever pitch, demanding a resolution. She did not step back. She stepped closer. The gap between them dissolved until the fabric of her skirt brushed against his trousers. "You don't get to decide what taints me," she said, her voice a fierce, low whisper. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised it, navigating the highly charged space between their bodies. She bypassed the rigid line of his arm, bypassing the headboy badge, and gently pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest. The physical contact was a visceral shock to the system. Draco gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, his eyes flying open. His stormy grey irises were wide, dilated, and entirely stripped of any remaining shields. Beneath her palm, she could feel the erratic, frantic thud of his heart, a desperate drumbeat that matched her own perfectly. The heat radiating from him was scorching, instantly banishing the ambient cold of the room. He stared down at her hand against his chest, as if she had just performed an impossible, forbidden piece of magic. "I am not made of glass, Draco," she murmured, using his given name for the very first time. The syllables felt heavy and intimate on her tongue. "And you are not poison." A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. The invisible tether that he had spent weeks violently hacking at finally snapped taut, pulling him completely under her gravity. He didn't push her away. Slowly, agonizingly, his right hand lifted from the edge of the desk. His fingers, trembling with the sheer force of his restrained desperation, hovered in the air for a suspended heartbeat before grazing the side of her neck. The bite of his silver ring was freezing against her warm skin, but the pad of his thumb, brushing lightly over her racing pulse point, was a brand of pure fire. The atmospheric pressure vanished entirely. There was no air left in the room, only the overwhelming, crackling static of their shared proximity. Draco leaned down, the shadow of his eyelashes falling across his sharp cheekbones, his gaze dropping to her parted lips. The distance between them was reduced to a mere whisper, his breath a warm, ghosting touch against her mouth. Hermione's eyes fluttered shut, an instinctual, terrifying surrender to the inevitable shift. She tilted her face upward, her fingers curling into the fine wool of his robes over his heart. Suddenly, the heavy grandfather clock in the corner of the office struck the first resonant, echoing chime of midnight. The deep, metallic boom was a jarring impact of reality that shattered the suspended bubble of their intimacy. Draco froze, his thumb still resting against her pulse, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers. He didn't pull away with the violent repulsion of their previous encounters, but the heavy anchor of the present moment brought them to a halting, breathless standstill. He slowly opened his eyes, looking down into hers with a profound, cavernous intensity. The ice was permanently fractured, the boundary lines erased. He let his hand drop from her neck, the loss of contact leaving a phantom ache in its wake, but he did not step back. He remained standing directly in front of her, entirely present, entirely stripped of his armor, as the final chime of the clock faded into the heavy, shifting shadows of the room. The resonance of the midnight bell lingered in the circular room long after the physical vibration had ceased to hum against the stone walls. It was a heavy, mournful sound that seemed to ground the ethereal, electrically charged atmosphere, pulling them both back from the precipice of a collapse that had been months in the making. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, pulsing crimson, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced over the signed documents on the desk. Draco's thumb remained for one final, agonizing second against the side of Hermione's neck. He didn't pull away with the jagged, cutting repulsion of their previous encounters. Instead, his hand slid slowly down the length of her throat, the friction of his palm against her skin creating a trail of static that made her knees feel dangerously weak. When his hand finally dropped to his side, his fingers curled into a fist as if he were trying to physically capture the lingering warmth of her. He didn't move back. The 2-foot boundary line that had defined their 8th year was gone, replaced by a vacuum of shared air that felt impossible to navigate. "The documents," Draco whispered. His voice was no longer a flat drawl. It was a rough, textured sound, a low vibration that seemed to originate from deep within his chest. "They're signed. The perimeter is locked." Hermione's fingers were still tangled in the fine, dark wool of his robes over his heart. She could feel the steady, rhythmic thud beneath her palm, a grounding force in the center of the storm. She didn't let go. She looked up at him, her eyes searching the fractured porcelain of his expression. The mask was not just cracked, it was discarded, lying in invisible shards on the mahogany floor. "I don't care about the perimeter, Draco," she said, her voice small but possessed of a fierce, unwavering clarity. A muscle in his jaw feathered violently. He looked down at her hand against his chest, his gaze tracing the contrast of her warm olive skin against his black fabric. He looked like a man staring at a miracle he was certain would vanish if he reached out to touch it. "You should," he murmured, though he made no move to displace her. "The world outside those walls hasn't forgotten who I am. The Ministry hasn't forgotten. That letter you saw in the library, they're lengthening the leash, but the collar is still there. It's made of iron, and it's cold." "Then let it be cold," Hermione countered, her grip tightening on his robes, pulling him a fraction of an inch closer. "I am not asking you for a world without consequences. I am asking you to stop pretending that you have to face them in a vacuum." The honesty of her statement seemed to physically wind him. Draco closed his eyes, his head dropping forward until his forehead almost brushed hers. The scent of winter frost and bergamot was so thick it was intoxicating. The visceral alignment of their bodies was no longer a combat of wills. It was a desperate, mutual surrender. "You are so relentlessly good," he breathed into the narrow space between them. "It's an assault. It makes everything else feel like ash." "I am not good," she argued softly, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I am calculated. I am logical. And logically, Malfoy, there is no version of this year where I don't think about you. There is no version where I don't wait for the sound of your footsteps in the corridor." Draco let out a ragged, shuddering exhale. It was the sound of a man finally letting go of a weight he had carried until his bones were ready to snap. He raised his hands, his long, pale fingers hovering near her face before he finally committed to the contact. He cupped her cheeks, his palms scorching hot against her skin. The silver ring on his index finger was a cold bite against her temple, but she welcomed the sensation. It was real. He was real. He tilted her head back, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a devastating, reverent gentleness. He looked at her as if she were the only source of light in a cavernous, dark world. "Granger," he whispered, the name no longer a barb or a shield, but a prayer. The magnetic pull reached its zenith. The atmospheric pressure in the room vanished. Draco leaned down, his movements no longer hesitant or panicked. He closed the final gap with a slow, deliberate inevitability. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't the tentative, fragile touch of a first kiss. It was a jarring impact of months of repressed longing and tectonic friction. It was the collision of fire and ice, a desperate, starving alignment that tasted of rain, cold ink, and the sharp, clean ozone of his magic. Hermione made a soft, broken sound in the back of her throat, her hands sliding up from his chest to tangle in the silk-soft strands of his platinum hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him closer, needing to anchor herself to the reality of him. The kiss was heavy with everything they hadn't said. The apologies that were too late, the fears that were too deep, and the undeniable, terrifying warmth that had been smouldering beneath the frost. Draco groaned, a low, visceral sound, his grip on her face tightening slightly as he deepened the contact, his tongue tracing the seam of her lips with a frantic, searching hunger. For a profound, suspended minute, the castle of Hogwarts, the war, The ministry and the weight of their names ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his mouth, the frantic rhythm of their hearts beating against one another, and the overwhelming, grounding sensation of finally belonging exactly where they stood. Draco was the first to pull back, though he only retreated an inch, keeping his forehead pressed firmly against hers. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as he fought to reclaim some semblance of composure. His eyes, when he opened them, were a stormy, brilliant grey, stripped of every defence he had ever built. "I can't offer you anything but shadows, Hermione," he whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, bleeding vulnerability. "I am a walking ruin." Hermione reached up, her thumb catching a stray tear that had escaped his guard. She brushed it away, her touch firm and certain. "Then we'll build something in the ruins," she replied. The silence that followed was peaceful, a quiet acceptance that draped over the room like a heavy velvet cloak. The fire in the hearth finally flickered out, leaving them in the soft grey light of the embers and the pale moonlight filtering through the high windows. They stood together for a long time, held in the gravity of their shared breath. The rivalry of the prefects had dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind only two people, fractured and exhausted, who had found a way to bridge the chasm. "You're still the most insufferable witch I've ever met," Draco murmured against her hair, the ghost of his old drawl returning, but this time it was laced with a profound, aching affection. Hermione leaned back, looking up at him with a spark of her usual defiance, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "And you are still a pompous, arrogant prat, but you're my pompous, arrogant prat." He let out a short, surprised laugh, a genuine sound that reached his eyes, transforming his face into something breathtakingly beautiful. He leaned down and kissed her again, a soft, lingering touch that was a promise of a future they both were still too terrified to name. The heavy oak door of the head office remained closed, shielding them from the world outside. For tonight, the shadows were not a threat. They were a sanctuary. The winter wind howled against the stone walls, but inside the circular room, the frost had finally, irrevocably melted. The first light of the winter solstice did not break over the highlands with a roar. It bled into the sky in shades of bruised pearl and pale, icy violet. Inside the head office, the embers in the hearth had long since turned to fine silver ash, yet the room was not cold. The atmospheric pressure had settled into a profound, grounding stillness, a heavy velvet quiet that felt like the first true inhalation after a lifetime of drowning. Hermione stirred against the dark wool of Draco's cloak. They had not moved from the small sofa near the window for hours, tangled together in a visceral alignment that defied the rigid geometry of their previous lives. Her head rested in the hollow of his shoulder, her cheek pressed against the crisp cotton of his shirt. The scent of bergamot and winter frost was now inextricably linked with the warmth of his skin, a sensory anchor that pulled her back from the edge of sleep. Beside her, Draco was intensely still, his breathing a slow, rhythmic tide. His right arm was draped over her shoulders, his long fingers resting near her collarbone, the silver ring a dull gleam in the dawn light. He wasn't asleep. She could feel the faint, microscopic tremor in his muscles, the hypervigilance of a man waiting for the world to reclaim its hostility. "The express leaves in 3 hours," Hermione murmured, her voice a low, raspy vibration against his chest. The arm around her tightened, a sharp, possessive reflex. Draco turned his head, his nose brushing against her temple. "Let it leave empty for all I care. The castle is locked. The wards are holding." "We have to be on the platform, Draco," she said, though she made no move to disentangle herself. "The head boy and head girl are required to oversee the boarding. It's the final duty of the term." He let out a short, dry huff of breath, a ghost of his old arrogance, but softened by a raw, aching vulnerability. "Always the diligent Prefect, Granger. Even when the world is ending, you're worried about the seating arrangements for the fourth years." "It's not ending," she countered, tilting her head back to look at him. The morning light was unforgiving, highlighting the sharp, hollowed angles of his face and the deep smudges of exhaustion beneath his eyes. He looked fragile, like a piece of ancient parchment that might disintegrate if handled too roughly. But the ice in his gaze had melted completely, replaced by a turbulent, searching intensity that made her breath hitch. "Isn't it?" he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a devastating gentleness. "The moment we step out that door, the friction begins again. The looks in the Great Hall, the whispers in the corridors. Your friends, my mother's letters. We are two different types of wreckage, Hermione. We won't just fit together because we spent one night in a vacuum." The use of her name was a jarring impact, a physical sensation that resonated deep in her marrow. Hermione reached up, her fingers sliding over his hand, pinning his palm to her cheek. "We won't just fit," she agreed, her voice steady and fierce. "We'll clash. We'll probably argue about the library fine system by Tuesday. You'll be insufferable and cold when you're scared, and I'll be relentless and overbearing when I'm worried. But the static, the pull, it isn't going away, Draco. It's the only real thing I've felt since the war ended." A brutal, agonizing flinch rippled through his frame. He closed his eyes, his forehead dropping to hers. The magnetic pull between them flared one last time, a heavy electric charge that demanded a final surrender. "I don't know how to be the person you see," he confessed, the words muffled against her skin. "I only know how to hide." "Then don't hide from me," she breathed. Draco opened his eyes, and for the first time the distance was entirely gone. He leaned down, capturing her mouth in a kiss that was fundamentally different from the desperate collision of the night before. This was slow, deliberate, and saturated with a terrifying, quiet hope. It tasted of salt and the cold air of a new day. It was a promise signed in the dark and kept in the light. When he finally pulled back, his knuckles were white as he gripped her hand, his thumb tracing the pads of her fingers. "Fine. If we must play the part of the perfect prefects, let's do it. But I'm not wearing the badge for them." They stood together, the movement jarring after the hours of stillness. Hermione straightened her robes, her fingers moving in their familiar frantic dance to align her cuffs. But this time, she didn't do it out of a need for control. She did it because she could feel his gaze on her, warm and steady, acting as a new kind of armor. Draco reached for his heavy winter cloak, swinging it over his shoulders with a graceful, fluid motion. He paused, looking at the head boy badge sitting on the mahogany desk. He picked it up, the silver glinting sharply, and pinned it to his chest with a grim, definitive snap. "Who's the best prefect, then?" he asked, trace of a genuine, crooked smirk touching his lips, the first real smile she'd seen on him in years. Hermione adjusted her own badge, the gold reflecting the rising sun. I believe the records will show I have more points for academic excellence and adherence to the curfew. And I, he countered, stepping into her space and leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear, have significantly better form when it comes to dismantling dark snares and keeping the head girl from freezing to death in the owlery. Technicalities, she whispered, her heart hammering a joyful, rhythmic beat. They left the head office together. The walk down to the great hall was steeped in a different kind of silence. The corridors were no longer abyssal voids. They were just stone and mortar. The tactile friction was still there, a humming current between their shoulders as they walked, but it was no longer a weapon. As they pushed open the massive oak doors of the great hall, 100 heads turned. The atmospheric pressure shifted instantly. The weight of expectations, the shock of seeing the lion and the snake walking in perfect synchronized step. Hermione felt the familiar prickle of anxiety at the back of her neck. She started to reach for her cuffs, her fingers twitching. Suddenly, a hand caught hers. It wasn't a hidden touch in the shadows. Draco reached out and laced his fingers with hers, his pale hand stark against the red of her sleeve. It was a visceral, public alignment. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his gaze fixed forward, his jaw set in a line of unyielding, marble-hard resolve. The silence in the hall was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely whistle of the wind. They walked the length of the hall, past the staring students and the stunned professors, toward the high table where McGonagall stood. The friction of the world was pressing in on them, cold and judgmental, but the heat of his palm against hers was a localized sun. When they reached the doors leading to the carriage path, Draco finally stopped. He looked down at her, his pale eyes bright with a defiant, beautiful light. "I think," he murmured, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "that the competition is officially over." "Is it?" Hermione asked, her voice clear and resonant. "Yes," he said, leaning down one last time, oblivious to the gasps echoing behind them. He kissed her briefly, a firm, grounding touch on her lips that tasted of victory and the sharp scent of the winter woods. Because the best prefect wouldn't have let the other one win so completely. He pulled back, his hand still firmly holding hers. The Hogwarts Express wailed in the distance, a long, mournful cry that signaled the end of the term. But as they stepped out into the biting cold of the morning, the snow crunching beneath their boots, they weren't walking toward an ending. They were walking into the raw, unscripted middle of a story that neither of them had thought they were allowed to write. The rivalry was dead. The shadows were still there, lingering at the edges of the forest and the corners of their minds, but they faced them together. The best prefects of Hogwarts walked toward the train, their badges shining, their fingers entwined, and for the first time since the war began, the air was finally easy to breathe. The frost had not just melted, it had nourished the ground for something new to grow. And as the steam from the engine rose to meet the pale Highland sun, Hermione Granger realized that she didn't need to be the best. She just needed to be his. And he, in all his fractured silver glory, was finally, irrevocably hers. The Silver Express was not just a train. It was a rhythmic iron heartbeat pulsing through the snowy veins of the Scottish Highlands. Inside the Prefect's carriage, the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the muffled, excited chatter of students heading home for the winter holidays. But at the very back of the cabin, tucked into a corner shadowed by the heavy velvet curtains, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a pocket of absolute, profound stillness. Hermione sat by the window, watching the frost-covered pines blur into a continuous streak of silver and white. Her headgirl badge was pinned perfectly to her robes, but her posture was no longer rigid. For the first time in 7 years, the frantic, buzzing need to control every variable had gone silent. The silence was not empty. It was filled by the steady, grounding presence of the boy sitting beside her. Draco Malfoy did not look like the haunted marble effigy who had walked the corridors in September. He had discarded his heavy travelling cloak, draped carelessly over the seat. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his sleeves were rolled back, exposing the pale skin of his wrists. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was looking at Hermione's hand, which rested on the seat between them. The magnetic pull was no longer a violent, erratic force. It had settled into a deep, resonant hum, a visceral alignment that felt as natural as breathing. Slowly, deliberately, Draco reached out. His long, pale fingers slid over hers, lacing together with a tentative, reverent strength. The bite of his silver ring was a cold contrast to the warmth of her palm, but she didn't flinch. She squeezed his hand back, a silent confirmation that the world outside the carriage did not matter. "You're remarkably quiet, Granger," he murmured. His voice was a low, textured scrape that vibrated against the hum of the train tracks. "Usually, by this point in the journey, you've memorized the entire roster of the second-year charms class and written 3 supplementary essays on the inefficiency of the trolley service." Hermione turned her head, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips. "The trolley service is perfectly efficient, Draco, and the second years are currently occupied with an illegal exploding snap tournament in Carriage C. I've decided to let the Ravenclaw prefects handle it." Draco raised an eyebrow, a spark of his old wicked mischief lighting up his stormy grey eyes. "An illegal tournament? And the head girl is looking the other way? The world really has shifted on its axis, hasn't it?" "It shifted months ago," she replied softly, her gaze dropping to their joined hands. "It shifted the moment you stopped trying to be a shadow." The atmospheric pressure in the small compartment thickened, but it wasn't the suffocating density of their early patrols. It was a warm, golden weight. Draco shifted, sliding closer until his shoulder pressed firmly against hers. The heat radiating from him was a physical anchor, a promise of safety in a world that was still healing. He reached up with his free hand, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw with a devastating gentleness. He looked at her as if she were the only thing in the universe that made sense. "I spent so long trying to convince myself that I was a poison," he whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, bleeding honesty. "I thought if I touched you, the rot would spread. But you just reached into the dark and pulled me out." "I didn't pull you out, Draco," Hermione breathed, her fingers tangling in the silk-soft strands of his platinum hair at the nape of his neck. "I just held the light so you could find your own way. You did the walking." The distance between them vanished. It It was an inevitable, beautiful collapse of two opposing forces finally finding their center. When he leaned in, the kiss was not desperate or panicked. It was a slow, deep surrender. It tasted of peppermint, winter air, and the overwhelming relief of finally belonging. Hermione let out a soft, contented sigh against his lips, her eyes fluttering shut. The train rattled over a bridge, the sound echoing through the floorboards, but they were held in a vacuum of absolute peace. Draco's hand moved to the back of her head, his fingers curling into her hair, holding her with a fierce, quiet possessiveness that made her feel more seen than she ever had in her life. This was the happy ending that neither of them had dared to dream of during the dark nights of the war. It wasn't a grand cinematic victory. It was the quiet, steady warmth of a hand held in the dark. It was the knowledge that when the train pulled into King's Cross, they wouldn't be walking away from each other. They broke the kiss, but they didn't move apart. Draco rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged and warm. "My mother is waiting at the platform," he said, the words heavy with the reality of the world they were returning to. "She doesn't know about us, about any of it." "Then we'll tell her," Hermione said firmly, her Gryffindor fire flaring to life. "Together." Draco pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The fear was still there, flickering in the depths of his pupils, but it was being systematically dismantled by the unwavering certainty in her gaze. He leaned down and kissed her one more time, a soft, lingering touch on her lips that was a seal on their new reality. "The best, Prefect," he murmured against her mouth, a true, brilliant smile finally breaking across his face. "The very best," she whispered back. As the Silver Express surged forward into the heart of London, the frost on the windows began to melt. The shadows of the past were still there, long and complex, but the sun was rising. And for the first time in their lives, Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger weren't afraid of the light. They were the light. The journey was long, but they had already arrived home.
Hi everyone, thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about two people who are very hard. Hermione and Draco live in the world of shadows. They had many secrets, they had a lot of pain. At first, they were like ice and fire. They stayed on opposite sides of the hall, but deep down they were both lonely. I wanted to show that love is not always easy. Sometimes love is a choice. It is a choice to stay when things are hard. It is a choice to trust someone with your scars. In the end, the frost melted. They stopped fighting the world and started supporting each other. Love can change the story, even for a boy like Draco, even for a girl who carries the world on her shoulders. I hope this story gave you a little bit of warmth today. Thank you for listening. See you in the next story.